Hi guys, we're back here with the examples or different types of quadratic functions. In this video I'm going to talk about two types, and then in the next coming videos we'll talk about the rest of them. Okay, so let us start with type 1, what I like to call as type 1, which is the simplest and the easiest type. So type 1, if I have a quadratic function So I have a quadratic function which we know by this point that it is expressed in the factored form and it is already set equal to 0. So if it is something in this form, which I like to call as a type 1, now for solving something in this form, one has to kind of go back and recall the fact that here one has to use the idea of a zero product property. And we know that the zero product property simply says that if the product of two quantities equals to 0, then either one of them, you have to set one of them equal to 0 as well as the other one equal to 0 as well. So in this case, what we do is you have the product of two, so you start by the first one, set it equal to 0, right? And you start solving for x. Now it turns down into a simple linear equation. We know how to solve that. I'm simply adding 3 to both sides. I get 5x equals to 3. Dividing both sides by 5, I get x equals to 3/5. Okay, so x equals to 3/5 is one of the solutions. But we already know that a quadratic equation can have up to 2 solutions, right? Now to find the other solution, we can set this other equation, 2x plus 3 equal to 0. And that is what the zero product property says. You set the first one equal to 0 as well as the second one. So when you set this equal to 0, again you subtract 3 from both sides. In this case you subtract 3 from both sides because we want to get rid of the positive 3. This crosses out. I have 2x equal to negative 3. Dividing both sides by 2, I get x equal to negative 3/2. So we have two values for x. Let us put them together here. What do I have? I have x equals to 3/5, and I also have x equals to negative 3/2. Guys, you can always check your work. I mean, you can substitute these back, and you should get the left hand side equal to the right hand side, which in this case is like you're supposed to get a 0. Okay, guys, that is the easiest type. But let me already tell you something that what I see sometimes some students make mistakes with. Guys, sometimes students, when they see something like, they're tempted, because we are tempted to like simplifying things, they're tempted to actually distribute this and simplify the left hand side. Guys, in this case, when you are solving a quadratic function, we do not really have to do that. If you do that, then you make it more complicated, and then you have to use something completely different to solve this equation. So the idea here is to just set each one of these factors equal to 0, but keep in mind there's a zero product property. So you have to have a 0 on the right hand side in order for you to set each of these pieces equal to 0. If you have something different than 0, then we cannot just set them equal to 0 or set them to that number. Okay, keep that in mind. Now the next one, the type 2 that I want to talk about in this video is something like this. So let's call this type 2. And as an example, I have x squared minus 120 equal to 0. Now this is completely different in a sense, like the whole the way of expressing the equation, and there's other things that are different in this when you compare it with this one. Okay, this was in the factored form, and if you look at this carefully, it looks more like in a standard form, right? We know the three forms: the standard form, the factored form, and the vertex form. Okay, we're not looking at the vertex form yet. Factored form, and this is the standard form. But there's something more unique about this one, and that is the x term is missing, correct? The x term is missing. Guys, if you have something like this where the x term is missing, again, there could be more than one ways of doing it, but I think one of the easiest ways to solve this would be using the idea of what you call as the square root method. Okay, the square root method. So how can we use a square root method? In order to use a square root method, we have to have x squared by itself and the constant to the right side. Okay, so how can we accomplish that? We can do that by simply adding 120 to both sides, and I get x squared equals to 120. Once I have 120 on the other side, now we can use what we like to call as a square root method. square root method. I mean, you can look this up online or you can check this out in your textbooks, but it is as simple as taking the square root on both sides and trying to simplify as much as one can. So we want to take the square root on both sides. And when I take the square root, the square and square root basically crosses out. They are opposites of each other. They cross out. So I'm left with x here. And in this case, square root of 120, we cannot just simply leave it like square root of 120. We have to try to simplify that. And we want to keep everything in radicals and not in decimals right now, okay? So let us see how we can simplify that square root of 120. Now there are a few different ways that people like to simplify that. Guys, one of the ways is you start with 120, and since you know the whole idea of square root is like you want to have a number which is a perfect square. So for this, what I'm going to do is we're going to try to come up with the product of two numbers so that at least one of them is a perfect square. So with 120, I always like to start with the smallest number. Let's start with 1. Well, 1 times 120, well, 1 is a perfect square, but that's not going to help us to simplify. So forget 1. Then let's go to 2. Guys, I already know the number that's going to work here, but if there's a bigger number than 120 and I don't know, I'm going to always start from a smallest number, okay? If you have other techniques or other ways of finding the square root or finding the radicals, you can use those, but I'm going to share you the method or methods here probably that I like to use. So then I go with 2 and 60. Well, 2 is not a perfect square, 60 is not a perfect square, so I'm not going to worry about it. I'm going to ignore it. Now 2 divides 120, then 3 also divides 120. Then I'm going to come up with, right, the two factors starting with 3 and 40, right? But none of them are perfect squares, so forget about them as well. Now I go to the third one, 4 times 30. Well, here 4 is a perfect square. Well, 30 is not a perfect square, but at least one of them is a perfect square. So our goal was to start with like at least one of them being a perfect square. So I can use these two and see how I break 120 as 4 times 30. Okay. Now there's other things that you can do, like think about 30 and try to break it down into product of 2 so that at least one of them is a perfect square. But if you try to do it like you'll get 2 times 15, that's not going to work. You get 3 times 10, not going to work. 4 does not go. 5 times 6, all right? And then I think those are the only possible factors. So none of them actually are perfect squares, so probably you can just leave 30 as it is. Now when you simplify this, I'm just breaking down and doing all the steps, so it's going to look like this. It's the radical of 4 times the radical of 30. Some of you guys probably don't like to write this step. You already know that radical 4 is 2, so it's fine, you can say that. And radical 30 is like, if you look here, you cannot actually break it down. You cannot actually simplify it any further, right? You can break it down as 2 times 15 or 3 times 10, whatever, but you cannot actually simplify. The whole idea is to try to simplify this as much as one can, but I think we cannot simplify radical 30 any further, so we got to leave it as radical 30. And that is my final answer. But there's one thing that you have to keep in mind when you do the square root and you're thinking in terms of quadratic functions, you are going to get a plus and a minus value. So that means x is 2 radical 30 and x is also negative 2 radical 30. Guys, keep that in mind when you are actually working with the solving quadratic functions, because quadratic functions can have up to 2 solutions. So when you take the square root in the context of quadratic functions, you have to have the plus value as well as the minus value. And later, if you like work on more of these type of problems, you will see that the radical solutions always occur in as conjugates, as complex conjugates, sorry, not in complex conjugates, but the conjugates of each other. If one is positive, the other one is going to be negative. So keep that in mind as well. So guys, that is type 1 and type 2. In my next video, probably we'll talk about type 3 and type 4. And then from there, we'll see how many other types we want to talk about, okay? But guys, you should actually practice these. That's one of the ways. I think that is the only way that one can get good at solving quadratic functions. Just practice more of these problems, okay? Follow my steps, follow my techniques, and then practice these problems on your own, okay? So till next time, take care, and I'll see you in the next video.